Corridors in an ambulatory just says follow business. Okay, you go to business, and what does business say? There's no requirements. Kind of goofy. It's this runaround that the code gives you, bouncing from page to page to page. So if you're in ambulatory, it says follow business. If you go to business for existing, there's no requirements, but there is requirements for new. Well, sort of. What new construction says is that where access to an exit, that should say exit by the way, are provided by corridors, it's where it is, then they have to have a 1 hour separate fire rating to that. And there's some exceptions to that. The trick with this is architects, engineers, don't call them corridors. If you call them corridors, you are subject to meeting all of these requirements, which means you have to have a 1 hour rating to your walls and so forth. Because there's an exception to it. If the exit is available from an open floor space, which is what a lot of business occupancies have, open cubicles, open floor space, then you don't need to have corridors. And exception number 2 says you don't need to have them if the space is occupied by a single tenant. The code doesn't define single tenant up in the definitions, but if you go back to the annex, they do say that a single tenant is meant to be a single management, where all the people work the same hours and all the staff is familiar with the whole space that's there. They give the example of a government complex that if you have different departments in a complex, they act pretty autonomously within each one of them, and so they don't count as a single tenant, even though the government may operate them, but if they're in different departments. And there are some inspectors who look at that and interpret that if you have different departments of the hospital or of the nursing home, then they may not be a single tenant, and you may not be able to meet the exception of not having corridors from that basis on it. So beware. But if you're in a fully sprinkled building, the corridor requirements do not apply. So there's big 3 exceptions. The best part of having a ambulatory or a business occupancy is all of those corridor requirements dry up and disappear. And that is a huge requirement, because corridors and hazardous areas, those are amongst the 2 biggest things that you get cited for. So get rid of those if at all possible. Now, corridor doors, they have to have the same fire resistance rating as 2-3 in Chapter 8, which basically says that there's no requirements under NFPA 80. Hazardous spaces under the ambulatory side, it just says just follow what's in the business occupancy. So fine, you jump to the business occupancy, and the business occupancy is a one that says, well, if you have hazardous areas, then you have to protect them according to Section 8.4. Section 8.4 is that you have to have an enclosed or sprinkled section. And they give examples of the different areas that you have to have. General storage, or if you have a boiler room, or if you have maintenance shop that includes woodworking. Those are the areas that they consider to be hazardous spaces. Well, that presents a little bit of a problem to the inspectors, because the inspectors, from my experience, they tend to use healthcare definitions of hazardous spaces. They still think in terms of the 50 square foot or the 100 square foot, or they still think in terms of if you have a space that is a trash room, or if you have a space that is used for a soil hold, that those are hazardous spaces. And you need to remind them that no, this is a business occupancy, it has to be general storage, and it has nothing to do with the 50 or the 100 or the square foot kind of a basis. In other words, this little chart that we use does not count. Do not follow it when you're in a business kind of an occupancy. In that, instead, it's the very simple rule that if you have a hazard greater than normally contained in the occupancy, and unfortunately there's no definition in the code for that, this normally contained is up to the AHJ as to what they consider to be normally contained is the area, but you either have to have it enclosed with 1 hour rated construction or sprinkled. And if you have it sprinkled, then you also have to have a door closer on it, because that's what it takes to resist the passage of smoke as defined in that section of the code. And for that reason, I highly recommend that your life safety plan include the definition, 2 definitions of hazardous areas. One is if you're using the top requirement for the enclosure, or using a different symbol if you're using the smoke tight method because they're due to different requirements, and you don't want to get caught up with one versus the other. And needless to say, the smoke tight one is a much less area of concern because you don't have to worry about penetrations above the ceiling and that kind of thing. In a ambulatory care hazardous area definition, they do talk about laboratories and they talk about anesthetic locations that are identical to the wording that's in healthcare. So you just follow those same things. There is no cooking regulations in a business occupancy. So you won't find that reference to NFPA 96 if you're in an ambulatory occupancy or if you're in a business occupancy. That's it on hazard. So it's a relatively simple thing to follow in there. There is a few exceptions, on what we're talking about.